In my humble opinion, this is the single most useful cooking ingredient you can make at home. I'm of course talking about broth, specifically chicken like the one here, and beef broth as well. Vegetable and fish broths are not as versatile in my opinion. So why do I think broth is so great? Well, because there is so much that you can do with it, so many uses for it, and there is a huge difference in the flavor when you use a homemade broth versus if you were to use like a store-bought bouillon cube or even just plain water. For the longest time, I thought that making broth was like the peak of the culinary arts. I have no idea why I thought it was so difficult to make and that somehow it required a lot of cooking skills. Well, it's super easy and the absolute beginners can do it as well. And in this video, I'm going to share with you a lot of tips and advice. So if you are a beginner, you can start making broth too. All right, so essentially you only need two things to make broth. Either some chicken or beef meat or some chicken or beef bones and water. And you just boil the meat or bones in water for an extended period of time and you get broth in the end. That is the absolute basic, and it is exactly what I did the first time I tried making broth. I've used, I believe, just raw chicken bones, put those in a pot, fill it up with water, and let it boil for 4 to 5 hours. And I had broth in the end. Was it the most amazing broth? No. But it was still broth. And since I was, again, for some reason, afraid of making broth or thought it was difficult, it was really helpful for me to dumb it down to the most essential steps, strip everything else away, and just start there. And that's how I made broth the first 1 or 2 times before adding in the other steps. So if you are like me, for some reason scared of it, then I would suggest you start there. Just boil some meat or some bones in water and get broth at the end. Now, in this video, I'll show you like the full scope with all the other optional steps that you can add to get even more out of your broth, specifically more flavor, starting with browning the meat and the bones. So in this example, I'm showing you how I am browning some beef bones that I had. So I do that in the oven. If I were to have some beef meat, I would brown that in the pot where I would then put in all the water and the other ingredients and boil it in that same pot. But since it's the bones, it's kind of a little bit more tricky to brown that in a pot. So I'm just using an oven. So I am baking the bones essentially at, I believe I did maybe around like 200 degrees Celsius on the oven for about 15 minutes. That seemed like enough. And then I transferred the bones into the pot. Another version of this that I'm also going to show you, that's kind of my favorite way of making broth, and chicken broth in this case specifically, is that I roast a whole chicken. Once it's roasted, I pick the meat off the bones, store that in a separate container, use it for whatever other cooking I have, and then use those browned bones from the chicken in my pot and fill that up with water, boil it, etc., continuing with the other steps. When you brown the bones and the meat, you are adding the additional flavor through the Maillard reaction. That's when all of the sugars caramelize and lots of other chemical reactions are happening that I'm not going to dive into. But what's important for you to know, it improves the flavor, makes it richer, more complex than if you were using raw meat and raw bones. So that is optional step number 1. In step number 2, you are putting the bones or the meat in your pot, filling that pot up with water, and then you are setting it to a boil. Now, you want it to come to that boil very slowly. You never want your broth to be boiling a lot of bubbles happening on the surface, because that just creates more, more chemical reactions that we don't necessarily want. A lot of the I guess, vitamins or nutrients evaporating through that process. It's definitely better for the broth to only simmer, which is only seeing a couple bubbles on the surface, just slowly kind of rolling up, nothing too active in terms of the boiling. At this point, once it's boiling, what you can do, or starts boiling, what you will see is this foam that starts building up on the surface. And again, you will only see that if you bring it to a boil slowly. If you do it quickly, if it quickly starts boiling, the foam will just, I guess, partially evaporate, but partially just incorporate in the broth itself. So this other additional step, optional, completely optional, is to skim the foam. Now this, from what I understand, is mainly done for aesthetic purposes, because what happens if you leave the foam in, like I said, it just mixes into the broth and it makes it more cloudy. So if you want a nice clear liquid, you would skim the foam, which from what I understand is just some protein strands that are dividing from the bones and the meat. Please feel free to correct my scientific explanations in the comments. But what I do know is that this is nothing harmful. For sure, it's nothing harmful. It doesn't change the flavor as much, or at least I haven't noticed any difference between when I leave the foam in versus when I take it off the top. What you would do if you wanted to take it off, you just get a spoon and kind of swirl it around the edges of the pot and just across the surface, dump it out and keep going like this. I usually completely skip this step. I don't bother with it. You know, if you've seen any of my other videos, that I'm not a huge fan of extra effort that doesn't provide a lot of results. So this is a step I usually completely forget about and don't bother with. But if you wanted to skim the foam, you should do it at this point before you start adding any of the other ingredients, because there's just more stuff in the liquid that you then have to kind of skim around and, avoid taking out any of your spices or any of the vegetables. It's just a lot more difficult to skim the foam when you have a whole bunch of other stuff in the liquid already. So if you want to do it now. If you don't want to bother, go to the next step, or if you've already done all of the foam skimming that you wanted to do, and add your vegetables. Now, for these vegetables, what I do is I like to keep a pack of them in the freezer. So I always have a bunch of those packs ready to go when I want to make broth. And the 3 vegetables that I keep in my vegetable pack is carrots, celery, and parsley. So those 3 root vegetables is what I typically add. But it is definitely up to you to do whatever you want or whatever you have as well. So again, if you are a beginner, or even not, you don't have to be a beginner for this, but say you only have carrots at home, well, just use carrots. You don't have to do everything to get a nice broth in the end. What I also add is an onion. So I slice the onion in half, but I'm keeping all of the skin of the onion on there. Same with the vegetables. I'm also keeping the skins on the carrots and the parsley. I think I might have took the skin off the celery just because that contains a lot of dirt and we don't want that in the broth. But other than that, it's usually just right underneath the skin where all of these vegetables have the most nutrients. So you don't want to be peeling that off, because then that cannot transfer into your broth. So it's best to leave the skins on. It also gives the broth a more richer color. That's coming from the onion and the carrots. So definitely leave the skins on. Also makes the job a lot easier for you. You could even be using the scraps themselves. So say you're using carrots for something else, you're cooking with them in another dish, and so you're peeling them. You could literally use the peels only of those carrots in your broth. It doesn't have to be the whole thing, the whole vegetable. So really feel free to do the bare minimum here as well, or just kind of whatever you can get. So adding vegetables is another step. And then the last step of what you can add is spices. So I would always add bay leaf and allspice. And again, those are just things I always have on hand, so I don't have to think about it twice. I think adding spices was like the second step that I did when I was learning how to make broth. So first I would do just the meat or the bones, and then next time I was making broth, I would add the spices because I already had them. I would cook with them in other dishes as well. So I had them on hand and I would just add them in. So they are a pretty easy way how you can make your broth tastier. And then the only thing that's left for you to do is wait. It's best to let your broth cook for a couple of hours. I usually tend to do maybe 4, 5, 6 hours, but there really is no like set, time period. Again, like with so many other things in the kitchen, it could be done, or if you needed 2 hours after you started it, then just use it. Use it 2 hours in. If you can, leave it in for a little bit longer, just to again have more time for the flavors to build up, to reduce the liquid just a little bit so that the flavor is kind of more packed in the remaining liquid. And so once it has been sitting on the stove for a while, I will transfer it into 2 types of containers. One are these silicone trays, or this one silicone tray, which I know like each of those boxes, each of those pockets is almost 100 milliliters of the liquid. So I'm packing that in and then storing that in the freezer. And this is great, especially when I'm then using only like a smaller amount of the broth, something like a sauce or in just some small amount, because it's only 100 milliliters. So I'll pop, 1 or 2 of these and use them for whatever dish. If I want to use it for something bigger, like a soup where I need a bigger amount of the broth, then I will use these glass jars, which I would store in the fridge. You could, of course, store those in the freezer. It's just I don't have space in the freezer for all of these big jars. So I would store these in the fridge and then use these within a couple weeks. Now, don't worry at all if once you put the jars in your freezer, you will then see like a thin layer at the top that's kind of hardening, like it's no longer liquid. And that's just fat that's rising to the top and then solidifying, I guess is the right word. But of course, you want to use that in your cooking as well. So don't throw that away when you are about to use the broth in that jar. It's also what seals the jar so that the liquid underneath doesn't spoil as quickly. At least that's something that I have heard. So it's definitely something useful and something you want to have on top of your jar. And that is it. That is the whole science of making broth. I hope that you can see how easy this is. And again, it just adds so much flavor to your food. So if you've never done it, you should definitely try this. And in my next video, I'll actually be showing you the ways I use broth, because I always feel like learning how to make something is just one step. And then if it's an ingredient, like in this case, the broth, you have to use it in something that you eventually are going to eat. So using it up is like the second part of the equation for me. And so that's what I will be diving into next week. And that will be it from me in this video. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.